take a little bit of a turn from innovation. They're almost as interesting to me as the things that changed dramatically during the lockdown crisis are the things that continued despite the lockdown crisis. And the emphasis on ESG has been, I think, sustained, no pun intended, in a way that many of us would not necessarily have anticipated beforehand. And I am delighted to welcome Alison Da Silva from Zeno Group and Charlotte West from Lenovo. And we are going to discuss the ESG frenzy and what you need to know. So hi, Alison.
Hi, great to see you and be a part of this discussion today.
I think one of the last human-to-human meetings that I had was with Zeno just about the time that you joined. So great to see you. I'm sorry, do we have Charlotte as well? Can we?
I know she just texted me, so I believe she's in the waiting room.
Okay. Let's get started anyway, because these things are moving along at quite a clip. And Alison, why don't we start by you just explaining a little bit about what makes ESG different from the sort of traditional notions of CSR and responsibility?
Yeah, I'd love to, because you're right. We are in an ESG frenzy right now. Thanks to investors, corporate responsibility, ESG, has sort of taken over the C-suite, and everyone is trying to figure out what it means and how it's different. Rest assured, both corporate responsibility and ESG are referring to the same thing: a company's responsible business practices. They're just coming in through different doors and looking at it through a different lens. So CSR is about how a company integrates social and environmental concerns into their operations. A materiality assessment is at the core to really prioritize what topics, material topics, a company should be addressing based on what is most material to the business, but also meets the needs of stakeholders, spanning consumers, employees, NGOs, and others. Corporate responsibility is meant to drive reputation, affinity, and be relevant to a broad stakeholder group. ESG, on the other hand, is an investor framework. It's used to measure sustainable and ethical investing. It's used by capital markets and by investors to really evaluate if a company is financially resilient, if they're managing risks, and how they're poised from a financial performance perspective for the future. So I think what we should sort of stop getting tripped up in semantics and just look at both corporate responsibility and ESG through the same lens. Today, where we are is that our audiences have expanded. Investors are now probably one of the most important stakeholders. We can't just approach this from a materiality perspective. We have to look at it from a risk perspective and make sure that we are, as communicators, ensuring that the right stakeholders are getting the right information in the way that they want. And they're going to take that information and they need that information in very different ways.
So that raises an interesting issue for me, because corporate social responsibility is a term that I think is quite easily understood by consumers, employees, the general public, certainly activist groups. It's one we've all become familiar with. I don't want to get hung up on nomenclature, but ESG seems to be a term that is designed to resonate more with shareholders and board members than with external audiences. Are we running a risk of sort of muddying the waters or confusing people by focusing on this new term when they've just gotten used to the old one?
You're right. I feel like, as you know, Paul, I've been at this for a long time, and I feel like we forever trip on terms and the nomenclature gets in the way. And that's why what I would encourage everyone to think about is, let's bring the two things together and recognize ESG is not a consumer term. It's not employees. It's not mainstream. You're right. It is very geared to specific audiences. investors, shareholders, public companies, are going to need to be thinking about ESG. But when we go back to overall responsible business practices, it's really important not to necessarily get tripped up in, is this corporate responsibility or ESG, but rather, what do our stakeholders want to know about our responsible business practices? And do that mapping exercise to make sure that you're not shoving ESG down a consumer's throat, but rather you're talking about what you're doing from a responsibility perspective across environmental or social topics that matter most to them.
Charlotte, I'm delighted you've joined us or rejoined us. Sorry if our technology failed you.
I think it was mine.
I know that Lenovo recently sort of moved from a corporate responsibility sort of approach or platform to an ESG platform, and I wondered what your motivation was for doing that and what kind of real world impact that's had in terms of acceptance and enthusiasm for what you're doing inside the company, and in terms of receptivity outside the company. Is it visible outside the company?
Yeah, you're right. And I apologize if I cover something that Alison may have said around the why we did that. And the real reason is that CSR, from our vantage point, was very navel gazing, was very, focused on internally what we were doing, and was a little bit old-fashioned in the sense in the way that people thought about it or the way the business thought about it. So ESG for us is much more of an outside-in view. What does the world care about? What does the world think about? What matters? What role do we play in that as a company? I think for us, it was about moving away from just always talking about what we do as a company, i.e. what we make, the PCs that we make, just as one example, to how we do it and why it matters. So that was really what drove the shift. I think the second part is also that we had some incredible insight from our reputation tracking data that has meant we're able to see the kind of disproportionate impact ESG has on our reputation versus maybe some of the other elements. So whether we're talking about our products and innovation, companies that make things tend to be very obsessed about the things that they make and how great they are. And they believe, whether you're a car company, perfume, PCs, whatever it happens to be, that what we make is the thing that matters most. And it's not. It's the how we do business and the role that we play in the world that actually matters more. So that's really what drove our shift. It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination, because it's not something we in the comms team own outright. There's so many influences around the company that we need to bring in, and stakeholders to help us move this forward. So that's really what kind of fueled the shift from our point of view. Paul, I can't hear you.
We can. Can I interrupt with a slightly sort of cynical question? Sort of my job. When you say that the data show that that people really care about the sort of ESG and how you do business, are you confident that that's driving behavior and not just something that people say because they think they're supposed to care about this stuff?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at consumer buying behavior, you're right. All the data says people will make choices based on what they think and feel about the company as much as what it is that they're buying. So that intent is there. Whether that actually translates to you standing in a supermarket and choosing one shampoo over a different shampoo because of a belief in what the company does, I feel probably have a similar opinion to you, and a little bit cynical about that still, in terms of it actually translating into buying behavior. I think where it is interesting is where we look at it from an investment point of view. So if you look at institutional investors and individual investors, there is the data there. And I know in the preamble for this session, the mention of BlackRock and what they're driving, I think it is driving the investment behavior. And it's driving the investment behavior because investors want to minimize the risk of what they're investing in. And ESG is the single biggest driver of being able to identify in the corporation you're investing in where there is risk. If you look at all of the, many of the bankruptcies over the past however many years, and the factors that have been played out in those bankruptcies all relate to ESG factors. We didn't call it then, like take Enron, for example, we didn't call it ESG then, but that was at the heart of the issue. So I think from an investment point of view, it is absolutely a factor.
And to build on that, what's so exciting, Paul, is now that investors are paying attention to this, it's showing the business case. You have organizations like RepTrak, who works with Lenovo, but even a recent McKinsey report that I read that is now really evaluating and connecting the dots around responsible business practices, ESG, to a return. For example, McKinsey just issued a report, and it said that those companies that are racially diverse are 35% more likely to have financial returns higher than the industry median, 15% higher than the median for gender diversity. So we're seeing now investors and different reputation and research firms coming out with clear data connecting the importance of this to the bottom line.
Right. Can we just talk for a moment about the S in ESG? Because that just seems like such a broad, all-encompassing term that I wonder how hard it is to sort of get your arms around that and make it concrete and meaningful.
Yeah, I can touch on that. So I think the S bit is tricky, and it depends on what kind of company you are, what your heritage is, what you do, all of those things as to where you can really lean in on the S. And I think Ben & Jerry's to me is always an example that's held up in high esteem for brand activism. We obviously saw in this last year the amount of instability in the world and some of the big issues that the world has faced, and companies that have chosen, rightly or wrongly, to lean in on some of those issues. And I'm thinking in particular of the George Floyd death and the Black Lives Matter movement. And some companies got that really right, and some got it terribly wrong, and some chose not to engage for right reasons. And I can be very open in this forum. There were reasons we didn't choose to engage because we didn't feel in some places that we had the credibility to be the loudest voice around that issue. There were companies far better placed to do that than us. That's not always comfortable as a comms leader internally counseling the business. They can be very emotional about some of those things as to why it's the right thing to do. And sometimes I think, we know this as comms pros, doing nothing is sometimes the best thing. It doesn't always feel nice at the time, but it is often the best approach. So I think that aspect, you've got to find your space where you're credible and you can make a difference. And that doesn't have to be leaning in on every news opportunity that exists.
The other interesting thing about the S is I feel that as from a corporate perspective, it's very easy to connect the return on the E, the environmental efficiencies, the savings. It can be very easily quantified. But the S is where I think we're going to see much more focus on this year and in future years. And I think the perception of the S in the past was around philanthropy and doing good, more around morality than necessarily bottom line. But the S is a big S. It's all things people, all things social. It's human rights. It's employee development engagement. It's your diversity, equity and inclusion. It's looking about the health and well-being of your supply chain. These are really big issues. And I think that what we're going to see is more of the financial case around that S, as we're starting to see in DE&I, and I think we're going to be able to map the return across those other topics as well.
That interests me because I think there's been a very interesting evolution in our discussion of sort of the relationship between business and society over the last couple of years. We used to talk a lot about the risk of getting involved with social issues. Now we talk almost as much about the risk of standing on the sidelines and being perceived as irrelevant. But it does lead companies into an often complex political environment where they're as likely to make enemies as make friends. And then if you take the international environment into consideration, it clashes you with the cultures of some of the markets in which you do business. How's Lenovo sort of calibrated its response to issues around the world and in different markets?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's a line that we tread every day around the world. I think if you going back to that Black Lives Matter movement, most, I would need to look back, but I would argue fairly confidently that most of the companies that came out with a really strong voice around issues to do with Black Lives Matter were American owned, American headquartered, with American CEOs, and with a very, very large proportion of their business in America. So it's understandable why, for them, the optics, the employee pressure, probably, etc., were a reason for them to right for them to come out on that. But our view is, we have to look at it globally. Just because we've got a huge employee base in the US, and just because that it was a huge issue in the US and beyond, I'm not, discounting how far that, moved globally as an issue.
Yeah.
You have to treat the world as one place, and we can't be too myopic and look at it through either a Western-centered view or an American-centered view. So I think that's the line that we tread all the time. It's like, well, if this happened somewhere else in the world, would we lean in on this as well? And if the answer is no, then we probably shouldn't in the US either. So I think that's the kind of approach that we take, is considering all of our stakeholders, all of our employees, and politics with as well. What is it right for us to do?
Do you worry too about sort of raising expectations, perhaps beyond the point where you can reasonably fulfill them? A friend of mine was always saying you could tell the pioneers because they were the ones with the arrows in their back, which itself is probably a problematic image in these days. But are you worried that you're sort of teaching consumers, and maybe activists in particular, to have extraordinarily high expectations of your behavior?
I'm not sure I thought about it through that lens, but it's certainly an interesting angle. Maybe we should look behind our backs a bit more often, perhaps. But I suppose in anything that we do in comms, it's always the risk versus the reward, right? So, and that's what the balance that we always look at. Is it the right thing to do? Are we credible to talk about it? If you've got an all-white, male, middle-aged, executive board, I'm not saying we have, but if that were the case, then you wouldn't talk about some of these issues because you've got no credibility. And I think the bit that we focus on much more with some of these big social issues is actually more around employees than it is about the outside world, because they are our strongest advocates and our strongest detractors in any situation. And you've seen that in particular in the US recently with Google and some of the individuals leaving the Google business that have, maybe left under unceremonious circumstances and not telling a great D&I story for the company. So, and you've seen the walkouts of employees as well. So to us, those kind of topics, it's the employees that we focus on first and foremost.
Okay, Alison, let me ask you that question in a slightly different and perhaps more upbeat way. Are we in danger of creating a race to the top to replace what for a long time appeared to be a race to the bottom? Are companies now going to be competing with one another to demonstrate the most social responsibility, the most awareness? And I guess, will everybody eventually have to join in, or?
Yeah, there's no question the bar keeps getting raised higher and higher. And the leaders with the arrows on their back continue to, really continue to push those boundaries. I think companies, it's our natural inclination to look at our competitive space and our peers and want to at least be equal, if not better than them. That's our nature. That being said, it's unrealistic for any company to think that they should be engaging on every single issue that is important in the marketplace, important to the business. It's not attainable. I like to say that companies need to, before they jump in on any issue of the moment, they really need to think about the why. What is their purpose? And have that be the filter for what issues to engage in. And I'm talking about now more the social side as well. Is it aligned with their purpose, their values? Is it something that they want to stand behind in the long term? If the answer is yes, then yes, jump in and raise a high bar, but don't feel that you need to across every single issue. You won't succeed, and it will not pass the sniff test of your stakeholders unless there's real action behind it. But yes, the stakes keep getting higher. In fact, one thing you could look at is net zero emissions. Right? At first it was 2050, 2 degrees Celsius, and now it's 2040, now it's 2030. I mean, there's this race to say, what companies can get there faster. And if you're always looking to just the competitive space, you're not going to be able to really drive that meaningful change internally within your own company.
What about
Paul,
this?
if I could just add to that, sorry.
Please.
I was just going to add to that one thing, that we shouldn't underestimate what a powerful forcing function in the business ESG is for us as comms leaders. We've managed to drive through change in the business by looking at some of the ESG topics through a comms lens. So D&I is one example where we felt that it was right that the company had a D&I report, and we were very transparent and public about our diversity and inclusion numbers around the world. And by forcing that through the business, then suddenly the behaviours change because people are accountable and it's public, and we're talking about it externally. So I think for me, that, to your point about being positive, I find that hugely exciting. From a professional point of view, is that we're now able to do that, and we've got a seat at the table that we would never have had before if we weren't talking about some of these big issues, these big topics, and being able to force real business change. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, or maybe longer, if we would be doing that, I probably wouldn't have felt as confident, as anywhere near as confident as I feel now about that.
Now, you guys introduced science-based targets for a lot of your performance criteria last year. What's the balance between sort of environmental goals and business goals here? And what are the metrics that really are driving you forward on this?
Yeah, I think the external third-party credibility of something like a science-based target is table stakes now. On the environmental side, it is, at least. You can't go out and talk about what you're doing around your environmental credentials unless you've got targets, ambitions, data to demonstrate what you've done. That is a base now. I think what's interesting about the E bit of ESG is that actually you have to look at, in our case, what our products help our customers do. So, a big supercomputer helping drive research into climate change, for example. You have to look at how you're innovating your products, and you also have to look at your business operations as well. But I think the business operations part, as you said, like the science-based targets, that's the core now. You can't not have that. I think it's the on top of that is needed now. I'm sure Alison's got some.
I was going to say, Alison, I sense you have something to add. Or...
No, I love it. It's finding, you're right, when it comes to the environment, there's no question. And when it also comes to ESG, they're looking for performance metrics across those key topics. They want to see the data. A lot of companies I find today are sort of in the middle. They're trying to figure out what those targets should be, what those metrics are, what they should be setting goals against versus a commitment, or, how to strike that right balance. And again, I think what's most important is really looking at, what those topics are that you really want to put a stake in the ground in and drive meaningful change. Because as I said before, you can't race to do all things, zero emissions, zero waste to landfill, and meet every single DE&I target in record time. But being thoughtful about setting that strategy and looking at those topics and what those either goals, commitments, and metrics are, because as Charlotte said, it keeps the company sort of accountable on moving the needle. And it also provides the data and the proof points and the stories that all of your stakeholders are going to care about. And again, I can't reiterate enough how important it is to know what stakeholders want what information. If you start talking about data and ESG to consumers, it's going to go right over their head. And investors don't want to read a 150-page CSR report. They want their ESG, Excel spreadsheet so they can see those metrics. So, finding that right balance is really, really important.
Just one final question as we sort of move towards our first coffee break this morning. I'm curious, what do you think is the most appropriate role for communications in this whole movement? Should we be driving this within organizations? Should we be partnering with other disciplines? And if so, which are the critical disciplines to sort of bring together? Should we be convening those disciplines, or are we just there to sort of help get the message out when the big decisions have been made?
Well,
I didn't
I think
know
from my
that question at all, did I?
no, you didn't. It's fine. Do you know what? From my point of view, we absolutely have to be leading it. We can't fix it all, but I think we're, to use my phrase a moment ago, the forcing function that helps drive it through the business and reminds the business and shows the business why it matters to our reputations and the risk of not doing it. In terms of the kind of people we need to convene at the table, it will be very dependent on every company. You know, in our case, you know, the S bit sits with HR typically and our chief diversity officer. The E bit sits within our sustainability team, which happens in Lenovo to report through the legal function. So it will be different in every company. I think the other thing is about getting kind of the business groups and the business leaders that you work with engaged as well, because they will be KPI'd in a very different way to other parts of the business. So their metrics will be set, you know, from a sales target point of view. So they care about selling products. So our job as, I think, communicators becomes really powerful in helping them understand the message of why this matters and how it will help them drive their sales targets in markets. So as communicators, we play an incredibly strong role, not only in forcing it through the business, but helping the business understand why it matters.
And from an agency perspective?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, in working with our clients in this space, it's still internally sometimes activities within the E and the S and the G are very siloed and they're not talking department to department. So there's no connected thread that's really laddering up to that larger reputation and business imperative and narrative. So while we can't control the emissions, you know, in your manufacturing site, we can be the one sort of bringing those different departments together for one shared objective. And again, ensuring that, you know, we're telling that comprehensive story that is needed. And oftentimes I feel that it's the communications department that is the one with the monthly meetings, you know, bringing those different functions together. So a very, very important role, especially as the stakeholder groups continue just to get even more complex.
I mean, ultimately, this is to me the very definition of what the words public relations mean. It's about the relationship between companies and the societies in which they operate and the world on which they operate. And it's great to see organizations like Lenovo, where the communications function is taking a lead in change that is, you know, no longer about spin and exaggeration and hyperbole, but is about real substantial change to the business operations, which is where we as a discipline have to be making an impact. So I think it's very encouraging that despite the fact that we could have been focused on 101 more urgent and apparently pressing concerns during the last 12 months, the focus on ESG has been sustained and even enhanced in a lot of organizations. And you know, I think we should be very optimistic going forward that that's going to be real and lasting. Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you, Charlotte. Great session. We're going to